Welcome everyone to this week's video lecture for History 1305 or U.S. History to 1877. This week we're talking about independent America. This will be the first time in our course that we're dealing with an actual independent nation rather than a set of colonies. Obviously, the last thing we discussed was the American Revolution, and so there's quite a drastic shift between the Revolutionary period and now trying to create a workable government. And so really what we're going to be talking about, there's a couple of different themes that come out of this week. But the major theme, and I've often heard this entire course described to me, and I tend to agree with this outlook. History 1305 is the story of two things in American history: republicanism and slavery. Those are the two things that we're looking at when we look at the late 1700s and the 1800s in American history. Really, when we talk about republicanism, this is an idea that is enshrined and entrenched from the earliest sort of organization of our government. We're not talking about the modern day Republican Party. We're not talking about political affiliation. Republicanism is a concept. And essentially, it's a concept that the American government is going to use, amongst others, to build out what they believe is a perfect or at least a great experiment in trying to build a new and better nation. You have to remember, America is the first in the age of revolutions. They are the first nation to launch a rebellion against a monarch. They're a first nation to establish the democratic process in a nation state in modern history. And so a lot of what America is doing is exactly that. It's a great experiment. No one knows when they're actually setting this up whether or not it's going to work. This country could easily just go and collapse down because it didn't have enough foundation to build on. So when we look at the concepts of American government, our founding fathers are generally pulling examples from three areas. The first is Enlightenment era philosophers, something we've already talked about. They look to Rousseau, Locke, Paine, these guys that are there coming up with ideas like the social contract, inalienable rights. There's a reason that these become foundational ideas of our government. They're taken from Enlightenment era philosophers and put into practice for the first time in history in the American government. And so a lot of these new notions are being rolled into the early structure of American government. The second area that the American founding fathers are going to look to for inspiration is way, way, way back in history. And then we're talking about basically Greco-Roman republics, mostly the old Roman Republic before the collapse of the Republic and the rise of the empire. So we're talking about BC days now. And so they look back, and the reason they do this is that Americans and Westerners in general, they look back to Rome as the heyday of Western civilization. When you look at, there's commonalities in all of Europe. There's a reason that Europe is generally, even though you have a bunch of different nation states, they all have followed a similar historical trajectory. And the reason for that is, at one point in time, they were all taken over by the Romans. And so a lot of Roman ideology is the basis for Western civilization. The thing that's common to England, France, and Germany is that they were all colonized by the Romans and were subjected to Roman rule. And so what Americans do at this point in time, and a lot of other thinkers too, is they look back and they say the height of Western civilization was the old Roman Republic. That's when Western civilization hit its peak, and that's really the most well-articulated understanding of a democratic government that we've ever seen in world history. And so Americans look back to that time period as a source of inspiration when they're putting their government together. And then finally, the Americans don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Essentially, what they're going to do is they build off of the British organizational frameworks that are already in place. We talked about colonial governance, how they all had a separation of powers into three different branches of government. That's something that the Americans are going to mimic. Basically, English common law will become American law. There's not a lot that changes. Murder is illegal in England and it's still illegal in America. And so there's a lot of these things that ultimately America doesn't just go, hey, We threw the British out, so now you can look at it culturally too. We don't stop speaking English. We don't stop following British holidays and traditions. They're basically British people who have founded a new country, and they don't just throw everything the British brought over here out. They use most of it actually in setting up the new government. And when we look at these influences, they take on a bigger meaning than just the political. Most of what we're talking about today is political, but it spreads to other areas of American life. America looks at education, religion, and the arts as critical to raising a well-rounded citizen. And that is the concept that we really, really need to get down to, the brass tacks. And this is what it's always about, being a good Republican citizen. And that means something. And in fact, the reason that you're required to take this class is because of the thought process that we're talking about right here, right now. Back in the late 1700s when they established this society and this government. The idea was that, look, it's great to be really, really smart in engineering. You're good with math, you're good with numbers, you can work these formulas, you understand engineering. But I don't want an engineer who understands only engineering, because when you engineer something, it needs to work for human beings. You have to understand human nature, which requires an understanding of philosophy. You need to know history to see who tried to build this stupid thing before and it didn't work and why. And so what we're actually saying, this is why you are in a liberal arts education. You're in a liberal arts university. What that means is at this point in American history, we said, I want a good citizen. I don't want a good engineer. A good engineer is a dime a dozen. Any idiot can do the math and figure out the numbers. I want a good, well-rounded citizen. That engineer should be as comfortable talking about art as they are about math. They should be as comfortable talking about history and philosophy as they are about hydraulic engineering. And this is what America is all about in its foundation, is creating the good Republican citizen. And what that means is they're trying to create, that you hear this word come up all the time in this period, the virtuous republic. This means putting the public interest in front of your own personal interests. And this takes on a different shape depending on who you are in American society. There's a big gendered component to this. Men are expected to engage in politics, national defense, and public and charitable works. That's what being a good Republican citizen is all about. So, I own a huge business, right? I make millions off my business. I'm rich, I'm wealthy, I'm well connected, I know everybody. But guess what? That doesn't make me a good Republican. To be a good Republican citizen means that I take all that money I made and I help people who are struggling in my community. We're looking back at a day, today we oftentimes think when the poor get resources, they have to be channeled through some government aid. That is not how they think of things in this time. The government has no role. If you're poor, the government doesn't care. It's none of their business if you're poor. You're poor, you're going to die poor. That's how they see it. It's not the government's job to step in and help the poor. It's your job as a rich person in your community to go into your community and see who needs help. And it's not enough just to own this business. I can't just own a business, go, yeah, I make a lot of money, feeling good. I'm done. I've done my thing. I'm just going to raise my family, have a good time. That's not a good Republican citizen. A good Republican citizen who makes a lot of money goes, I've made my money. Now it's time to get engaged in public politics. I should try to shape our public society for the better. If somebody threatens my community, I'm not a soldier, I'm a business owner. But if they threaten my community, I'm going to raise a militia and I'm going to kill them. And that's what it's all about. You have to be a well-rounded citizen as a man in the virtuous republic. And that is very, very important. It's something that comes back again and again in this early period. This is what they're trying to instill in our kids in school in this period. This is what they're telling adults you need to be. And then women, on the other hand of this, are expected to build into this model, but in a different way, in the domestic sphere. Knowing that women are actively kept out of the public sphere at this point in time, their goal is to raise strong Republican children, and they need to support their Republican husbands. In other words, if you're a mother during this period, you are expected to follow models of Republican motherhood. If you have a son, you encourage them into civic, political, and business leadership. You turn them into good public figures who can speak to large groups of people, persuade people to do the right thing, persuade people to put their community in front of themselves. And then on the flip side, if they have daughters, well, then it's their job to turn those daughters into good wives and mothers themselves who can someday support Republican children and Republican husbands. So these firms, these sort of behavioral norms, they push men and women further into separated spheres of American life. There's no doubt about that. Women become more firmly entrenched with this idea of Republican motherhood in that domestic sphere. But it does open up opportunities. More and more women start getting a secular rather than a religious education. Now it's no longer about making sure you're living right by God, but living right by your Republican values. And in order to do this, there needs to be a more robust public school system in place to give people that secular education. Now, moving forward, when we talk about this idea of virtue, George Washington is held up as the American prototype of a virtuous Republican citizen. And a lot of it has to do with what he did during the war. If you remember back to riding out on the battlefield, picking up that flag at the Battle of Princeton and rallying the troops to continue fighting and taking the fort, that was an example of a good Republican leader. He's a military commander. He shouldn't be on the front lines. If he gets shot, that's a huge, huge tactical disadvantage to the Continental Army. But he realizes that his well-being is not as important as the well-being of this dream of America that he's fighting for. So he puts his own life on the line and rallies his troops. He puts the good of the American independence movement in front of his own life. That's where this whole myth about Washington kind of gets started, is this idea that he is this real virtuous citizen. And when the revolution comes to an end in 1783, if you're to ask George Washington, all right, what now, man? What's next? He's not going, I want to become the president of the United States. That position doesn't even exist. He wants to retire from public life altogether. He has a plantation in Virginia. He just wants to go back and work on his plantation. But as he's trying to do this, as he's trying to get out of military and public life, there's a segment and a number of military leaders in the Continental Army that start planning a coup to overthrow the new American government. This is known as the Newburgh Conspiracy, and it happens in March of 1783. Pretty much what this is about is the inability of Congress, and at this point, and we'll talk a little bit about the existing governmental structure. Throughout the war, there's a de facto government known as Continental Congress, something we talked about in our last lecture. Well, the Congress is the only body to govern the United States. The problem is Congress cannot raise tax revenues. They can't tax citizens to raise money. And so they have no money. They can't pay their soldiers, they can't pay their officers, and they can't pay out the pensions to the military. And so, obviously, it's a bad idea to have a bunch of guys with military experience and weapons sitting around dissatisfied with your brand new government. And so these officers start planning a coup. They meet together in Newburgh, New York, to come up with a plan to overthrow Congress and take over the American government. So within the first year of this becoming a truly independent nation that's recognized by Britain, we almost collapse into a military dictatorship. And if it weren't for Washington, this conspiracy might have been actually acted upon. Washington rides out and he meets with this collection of army officers in 1783 when he hears about this coup. What he basically does is he goes up there and he shames these guys into giving up the coup. He goes, I'm sorry, guys. I've grown old and gray in your service. In other words, I've been here fighting for the independence of this nation, putting my own life on the line the entire time. I'm an old man now. And so, I'm sorry if you didn't get your pension, but think about what I've been through in my lifetime, from colony to independence. Think about the wars that I fought. Think about the things that I've done to put us in this position. And it's all about him coming forward and basically shaming these guys into going, oh man, I guess we don't have it as bad as we thought. And so after he's able to hold off this coup in New York in 1783, America looks at Washington as being an absolute symbol of American virtue in public and civic life. They elevate him in this. It's this kind of discussion around Washington, this heroic idea. They call him the American Cincinnatus. And Cincinnatus was a figure in the old Roman Republic. Again, they kind of go back to those ideas, who was seen as incredibly virtuous, who was always thinking about the greater good and pragmatism. And that's how George Washington is going to be viewed in the early Republic. This is what basically pushes him into the role of America's first president. There is nobody in America that doesn't vote for George Washington in the first election. He's unanimously selected as America's first president. Now, what that means is it shows us that how Americans are thinking about George Washington. They see him and they see this guy who just is always all about the well-being of America and never about himself. And so that's why he's seen as a great leader during this time period. So this idea of virtue is found in almost every American institution of this time period. You start looking at the state constitutions. They started drafting these during the Revolution, and they continue after it's over. Virginia and Massachusetts all start to include specific language talking about virtue in American law in their state constitutions, about how virtue is this true quality upon which the nation is built. Architecturally, we see this. America turns away from Georgian-style construction. That's the type of construction that was popular in England during the colonial period under King George III. They're very creative with these names. But it's the red brick with the white trim that you tend to see in older cities. So there's not a lot of that down here in the American South, but up in the North, where I'm from, if you go to a city like Boston or Philadelphia, you can immediately pick out the old colonial buildings, the Georgian-style construction. And you know that this predates the independence of America, that it's older than the nation itself. Because you see that red brick with the white trim, that's something that was built during the colonial period when we were still British. No, now not Americans. What they do is they get away from Georgian-style construction and they start mimicking Roman construction, what they call classical or humanistic architecture. It's not necessarily Roman. The Romans took their style of architecture from the Greeks before them, and it's kind of blended together. What you see is that we look at public buildings now. You have like the White House with big, tall white pillars. This is very Romanesque. All of our state capitals have a domed roof like you would find in ancient Rome. The Washington Monument is a giant obelisk that would be seen in the ancient world like in Egypt or Rome or Greece. We do use white stucco now instead of red brick. It's just even the way we build changes. Our public buildings no longer, we say, we're not British anymore, we're something else. And this is how we're going to build to reflect that. Public education is used as a means of reinforcing virtue as well. So what we see here is that more often than not, white women who are in the upper, middle, and upper class are going to increasingly be included in America's educational model to reinforce this idea of Republican motherhood. One of the earliest presidents, the second president, John Adams, his wife, Abigail Adams, is a major advocate for female education. She's looking to reform America's education system and make secular education for all girls in the United States compulsory. She never really gets there, but she makes strong efforts towards it. Religiously, America is still predominantly Protestant. And what they tend to do now is they go, virtue is the most important thing in America, and America is mostly Protestant, therefore Protestantism must be the most virtuous religion. And so that's what you start to see here. They reinvent that religious tradition as being the only one that instills virtue and civic responsibility in its adherents. So early in the early republic, you still see Jewish and Catholic men are barred from holding office in a number of states. But that's generally kind of a statewide law that you have to go and take a look at and see what's going on in different areas. But when it comes to religion, one of the earliest moves that America is going to make is a separation of church and state. This is kind of a foundational idea of American government. Founding fathers are looking at this situation and they say, every time religion gets enmeshed in politics, it generally is going to be used to oppress a group of people who don't believe that religion. They also felt that religious views could corrupt political views. In other words, clergy members can start actually taking political office, and then political and secular power all become enmeshed. Or political and religious power become enmeshed, where you can't tell the difference between a church leader and your governor. And so that's something that they have a very serious concern about in the early Republic. And so if you go back to the founding of these early colonies, we have the Catholic colony in Maryland, the Quaker colony in Pennsylvania, Puritanism in New England. There's a specific religious tradition tied to a lot of these areas of the United States. But under the new American government, that relationship largely gets abandoned. And so basically the states start first, and they start getting rid of any religious component to take an oath to hold office. Before that, you have to put your hand on a King James version of the Bible and be sworn into office. That doesn't work for a Catholic. A Catholic can't swear on the King James Bible. A Jewish person can't swear on a Bible of any kind. And so what we're seeing here is that the states come first, and then the federal government's going to follow and say, look, you don't have to have any religious tradition. You don't have to swear on the Bible to take office in the United States. And really, we can look back to the First Great Awakening, where we see Baptists and Methodists emerging and gaining in strength and numbers in the United States. And these new evangelical religions are pushing for a separation of church and state. They're becoming bigger. They're becoming they're not dominant yet, but they're becoming the new dominant strains of religion, particularly in the American South. And so they are concerned, though, because they're still not the national majority. They're worried that if puritanical Protestantism gets enshrined as America's national religion, then it will be used to hold these other groups down. One idea that was floated during this time period is a lot of Protestants said we should have equal support for all Christian churches. That doesn't include Catholics in the Protestant mind in the 1700s. Catholics are not Christians; they're papists and basically devil worshippers or cultic members. And so what they're sort of saying here is that they want any kind of Protestant church should be supported by the American government, but Judaism, Islam, Catholicism, Sikhism, Hinduism, none of those are part of the American governmental structure. And so that's a very popular initiative that gets floated in 1785. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison step forward and say, no, here's what we need to do. We don't have a state religion. The United States government, there is no religion tied to what we do. This is a secular government. We're not a theocracy. We don't have to pick a state religion. And so from 1785 forward, with the work of Madison and Jefferson, we're going to see that America's government has no official religion. Now, you'll often hear people say this is a Christian country. And certainly, I think any historian, regardless of their own background, is going to have to say, yeah, we have to acknowledge the fact that this country was founded on mostly, especially if you're talking New England, puritanical religious ideals. In other parts of the nation, there are other different denominations, but for the most part, Christianity is the dominant ideology of America. And that doesn't change with the separation of church and state. It changes how the government uses religion. And that's what's most important. The government cannot say you have to be Protestant. They can't say you're not allowed to be Muslim. They don't have that power. They don't have that arrow in their quiver anymore that they can pull out. So from 1785 forward, we have a clean separation of church and state. There is no national religion here in the United States. So there's also some economic considerations and shifts that are going on here in the early republic. Namely, the political class is changing. In the pre-war period, in the colonial period, politicians are incredibly wealthy. We're talking like super wealthy, not like River Oaks wealthy, Deep Memorial wealthy. And so that's the kind of resources that were available to the political class. After the revolution, politicians in America become decidedly more middle class or moderate in terms of their wealth. And this is important because one of the earliest crises to face the United States is economic in nature. They have a serious problem between debtors and creditors. And so they start to get into all these fights about currency reform at the national level. So at the end of the war, there's a number of people who are owed money, and those are creditors. And there are a number of people who actually owe someone money, and those are debtors. Debtors are pushing as soon as the war's over. Remember, we were working on a Great British Pound. Well, now it's time for us to start minting our own currency and issuing money. And so debtors are arguing that the government should just start printing paper money to ease the shortage of currency that is sort of rampant in post-war America. That's because they owe someone money. This is, I don't want to get too deep into economic rules and stuff like that, but when you just start printing money with nothing to back it up, it leads to something called inflation. And basically, you can take that money that you printed and blow your nose on it because it's worth as much as toilet paper. This is what happens with inflation. But here's the deal. Debtors say, I owe someone money. I'd rather pay him back with $100 that buys you a loaf of bread rather than $100 that buys you a cow. And so that's the major difference here, is that debtors want inflation to happen because when they pay back their debts, the money's not worth as much and it's easier to come by. Whereas creditors want to maintain what are known as hard currency rules. What they're essentially saying is, somebody owes me money and I don't want them coming. I lent them $100 worth of buying power. Now they're coming back and giving me a $100 bill that's got about $10 of buying power. That's not fair. I didn't want $10 back. I wanted $100 back. In fact, I wanted 100 plus interest. That's how that generally works. But that's the kind of breakdown we have going on. That's a battle over economics in post-war America because you have a lot of haves and a lot of have-nots. And so these more moderate wealth politicians are going to step forward, these more middle-class politicians, and say, we need to make things easier for the debtors, the people who owe money. And so they invent something known as stay laws and tender laws. Basically, stay laws just say that you have a much longer time to repay your debt. If you lent me $100 and I was supposed to pay you back in 6 months, the American government's going to come along and say, no, he has 3 years to pay you back. So that's how it's going to help me as a debtor. I get a longer time to pay that debt back. Then they also have what are known as tender laws. This is kind of unique, and it's specific to basically farmers. And farmers are in copious amounts of debt at this point. They owe a lot of money. And so these laws say, the tender laws say, you don't have to pay your debt back in currency because there's a currency shortage. So instead of printing more money, what they say is you can pay your debts back with goods. You can pay them back with whatever you have. And this is a problem for debtors, or for creditors. Debtors love it because I'm a poor farmer and I grow potatoes. I'm just going to go pay my debt back with a sack full of potatoes. But if you're the creditor, you lent someone money. You don't want potatoes back. You don't want a goat. Don't bring me a goat for the $50 I lent you. I want $50 with interest, not a goat. But this is going to force creditors to take whatever somebody can pay their debt back in. Now you're giving me a goat that I have to go sell. But that's how these laws are going to favor the sort of lower and lower middle class, the people who owe money. So when we look at what's going on here, there's clearly a lot of economic problems going on in the United States of America. And to be very, very honest, these economic problems are largely the result of a document known as the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation were issued in 1781 by Continental Congress, right at the tail end of the war. Essentially, the Articles of Confederation are America's first constitution as a nation. But this constitution of sorts is incredibly weak. Essentially, what it says is all of these different places, because remember they were different colonies, disparate colonies, it says we agree to come together and make a confederation and work together. That's about it. That's all the Articles of Confederation really say. This document, this founding governmental document, does not allow the government to tax people. It doesn't allow you to tax citizens. And you can think about why this might be, right? What was the American Revolution all about? Taxes. If we were in a real class right now, I would have hoped somebody would have yelled taxes. But that's what it was supposedly on the surface really all about. So how could the government, while this war is going on, turn around and say, we need money, can you guys pay us some tax dollars? They can't do it. They can't tax their people because they're fighting a war over taxes. And so this is a major problem because I don't care what your ideological underpinnings are about representation in Parliament. Governments need money to run their basic operations. And America's no different. They need money and they need tax dollars and they can't raise them. And so this is going to become a recurring theme all throughout the 1780s. This is the weakness within the Articles of Confederation is what forces Americans to, well, really the founding fathers, to sit down and draft the Constitution of the United States of America. They're trying to fix these problems with the Articles of Confederation. So, really what the Articles of Confederation could do, this is the limit of their power. Hey, we're all working together as a nation, and Texas, I need more bullets from you. And then Texas has the ability to say, sure, all right, we got some extra bullets, here you go. And they give them to the national government or army or whatever they're trying to do. And then, or Texas could say, I don't have any bullets, get lost. And there's no punishment. So there's really no reason they work off of what are called requisitions from the states. If we need something, we ask for it, but nothing really compels the state to give the government what they're asking for. And so really what we're looking at in this period is that America cannot raise any money, and they're in a really precarious position as they've just become independent and they're completely flat broke. So the Treaty of Paris is going to end the war in 1783, but there's some other international problems going on for America here. First and foremost, access to British trade goods were restricted during the war. Obviously, if the British are fighting a war with American colonists, they're not going to keep bringing products into the United States. So the British merchants are going to come back immediately after the war. And remember, everything they're selling is like a luxury good. It's really nice stuff that a lot of people want real bad. It's kind of like everybody needs a car today, but we don't all need Corvettes. Well, the British merchants are selling Corvettes. And they come back and the Americans have no money. And so the British are going, sure, purchase stuff on credit. That's fine. Yeah, go for it. And then they're going to come back calling for their debts someday. And this is going to be a major problem for the American economy because now American buyers and sellers and merchants are all now indebted to the foreign nation we just got independence from. This is an ugly scenario, and America is going to have to move quickly to try to put a stop to this. Secondly, trade with the West Indies had been pretty much entirely cut off. It will come back after the war, but never at the strength it was before. And America relied upon West Indian trade. That was really the backbone of trade in the colonial period. And so America is going to have to forge new economic models because they're no longer getting money from this trade from the West Indies in the way they did prior to the war. Then finally, the British Navy still controlled the Atlantic, and American ships were constantly being attacked by the British, by the Spanish, by the French, but most embarrassingly, they're getting ripped apart by pirates off of the Barbary coast of North Africa. This is humiliating because American fleets, if you're familiar with the geography of North Africa and Europe, you've got to sail through something called the Gibraltar Pass. You can stand in Africa or southern Spain and see across the Gibraltar Pass. You can almost spit across this thing. It's so shallow, narrow. But what it does, it forces the Mediterranean's a huge trade area of the world. And it forces anybody bringing a ship into the Mediterranean to go through this pass really close to the North African coast. The pirates know this on the Barbary coast. And so they would raid American fleets. They'd steal the ships. They'd put the sailors basically into slave markets and try to ransom them to the American government first. And if nobody paid for them to get them released, they would just sell them into slavery in North Africa. So obviously, there's a major economic burden going on here, right? We're not conducting trade with a very wealthy area of the world successfully. We're losing boats left, right, and center. We're losing the men who work on those boats. That's all value and resources. But in addition to it, it's really humiliating. This gives a black eye to the Americans across the Western world. Every other nation has found a way to successfully defend themselves from pirates. That's not to say they don't get taken, but never at the numbers that's happening to American ships. And so what this is basically, the British, the French, the Spanish, the Germans, the Russians, they all look at Americans and they go, you guys can't protect your ships from some North African pirates? And it's embarrassing to the American government. This is a source of extreme humiliation. And those people our citizens are being sold into what's known as white slavery in North Africa. And so a little later on in the 19th century, America and Britain are going to get together after we've put aside some of our differences. And they actually start raiding all the coastal towns of North Africa and putting an end to this kind of piracy, making that area safe. But this is just a source of international humiliation for America, and it's a source of economic burden. because we're not conducting successful overseas trade. So there is another region that we need to discuss here that isn't technically in the United States quite yet, but it will be very, very soon. That is what is known as the Northwest Territory. And I will say that this is definitely going to show up on an exam because it's a subject very near and dear to my heart. In the way that you all learn about the Texas Revolution, I learned in school about the Northwest Territory. I learned about exploration of this region and all of the wars that occurred on the Great Lakes because this is where I'm from. So we're talking about the area of like Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Ohio. These are the areas that make up the Northwest Territory. And we got this because if you think back, this area all belonged to New France back before the war, the French Indian War. Well, after the French Indian War, it converts to the British. They get it. And so right after the Americans win the Revolution, then all of a sudden the Americans now own this area called the Northwest Territory. And they call it that. This might seem confusing to you, but they call it the Northwest Territory because as far as Americans are concerned, the nation pretty much stops at the Mississippi. So the Midwest and the Great Lakes, those are all, that's as far north and west as Americans have gone at that point, at least in any great numbers. Now, here's the issue with the transfer of the Northwest Territory. When you go back to the American Revolution, you might remember me talking about the fact that most of the Native Americans chose to fight alongside the British. And in this particular region of the nation, they almost universally chose to fight with the British. That's a big problem because the British left and they gave the Northwest Territory over to America with no consideration for the Native Americans living there. When the U.S. takes over this territory and it becomes part of American political property, they look at the Native Americans. These are the same guys who were just running around killing American people. They were the ones fighting alongside the British. They shot at the families of people settled out in these territories. They killed people. And so when you look at these Native Americans, as far as the United States government and most of its populace is concerned, these are enemy combatants. They wanted to kill us just a few short years ago. They picked up weapons and tried to kill us. So they fought and they lost. And like any nation, Native Americans are no different. They don't get a pass. You tried to fight a war against us and you lost. Now you're going to suffer the consequences. So they are considered a subdued or defeated people by the American government. But the Native Americans don't accept this claim. Remember, we're talking about thousands of different little tribes and different clans and different nations, confederacies. They didn't all fight with the British, but they're all treated the same because Americans don't take into consideration very strong opinions about ethnic and racial difference as it comes between Native Americans. Really not racial, but ethnic anyway. They're not looking at them as individual groups. They're saying Native Americans fought with the British. You're all defeated people. And what that means in political talk is you don't get a right to say anything. I don't care whether you think we should or shouldn't settle in this territory. We're settling in this territory, and if you don't like it, it's time to wipe you off the face of the earth because that's what you tried to do to us in the last war. And so there's always this idea underpinning American history of American exceptionalism. And it works both ways. In the same way that you have people, misguided statements like America's the greatest country that's ever existed in the world, you also have people saying America's the worst country that ever existed. And it's neither. It's just a nation that's a representative of its time. And in this time period, as far as the Americans are concerned, they tried to kill us. Why shouldn't we kill them? And so people often look back very sympathetically, and I think rightfully so, towards the plight of Native Americans, who basically had this siege brought on them. But you do have to consider it from the vantage point of Americans in the 1780s, which is, I have no love for these people. They'd just as soon cut my scalp off or shoot at me as they would do business with me. So I don't want them living in my territory. I want them out. And this is going to lead to some major conflicts in the Northwest Territory. And this largely explains the attitude of Americans. It's not happening in a vacuum. Americans aren't just naturally racist people who hate everybody who's not white. What we're talking about here is that they have a reason to be upset with these Native Americans, and they're going to treat them like any other vanquished foe in war. You lost, now you suffer the consequences. And this is a huge problem. The Native Americans in the Northwest Territory, They number somewhere between 150 and about 200,000 people. That is a tiny, tiny, tiny proportion. Because by this time in 1783, when the war is officially over and the Treaty of Paris is signed, American citizens in that region alone are at 2.4 million. And so this is really, you can see the discrepancy in numbers here, where no matter what the Native Americans try to do, let's say if they put up some valiant resistance effort, it's not going to work. You're outnumbered 10 to 1. And so it's just, there's no way. And basically, this is going to create a constant, continuous pattern of small-scale conflict in the Northwest Territory. The U.S. military will move out there for a number of years, but mostly it's militias and individual settlers in that territory having to pick up arms and defend themselves against Native American raids. In addition to this threat in the Northwest Territory of Native American raids, American settlers are also looking at the fact the British never leave this territory. They stay garrisoned in the forts there, all along the Ohio Valley River, or Ohio River Valley. And then the Spanish are down in Florida still, and they represented a threat to American interests down on the lower Mississippi River. So the whole western frontier is kind of a wild, dangerous place to Americans. But the Northwest Territory is the one that's foremost on their minds when they get out of this war. So Jefferson is going to be the person who takes on the task of organizing this area. And I'm going to basically gloss over the various ordinances to just sort of focus on the last ordinance that Jefferson and the Congress of the United States will be passing. And that is the Northwest Ordinance. It's important for you to review the lecture slides on the previous ordinances, seeing where some of these influences are coming from. But essentially, what we're going to do is focus in on this Northwest. This Northwest Ordinance is the most important. This is how all of those territories became states in the United States. So, the Northwest Ordinance is the final act governing the settlement of the Northwest Territory. It is going to abandon some of Jefferson's attempts. He said earlier on, we should just give these states immediate self-government and make them equal in footing to all the existing states that were here as colonies before the Revolution. Most people don't agree with that, so they toss that out. But what it does do is it starts laying out the ground rules for establishing state governments in these areas. And it also adopts Jefferson's territorial structure, the way he drew these areas up on a map. You can see this today. If you go up to where I'm from in Michigan, you pretty much can, everything is built in a grid. We have counties that are squares, and they're 6 by 6 miles. And then you go to the next one, and that's a square. And we just keep building squares. It's like that all around the Midwest. We tend to build everything in grid patterns. And this was something that is a holdover from when Jefferson organized the area on a map with a grid. And so this is kind of has some resonance all the way up till today. But the governors in these new territories would be appointed by Congress. And then when the population in one of these territories hit 5,000 free male settlers, they could then elect their own territorial legislatures. When the population hit 60,000 people total, male or female, they could then apply for statehood in the Union. So when we look here, what we're seeing is education, civic responsibility, these ideas of the virtuous republic. If you go and pick up the state constitution in Michigan, if you go and pick up the state constitution in Indiana or Ohio, that word is just riddled throughout. And it's because of the time period when these states were being organized. They even say right in the Northwest Ordinance, it says, religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind. For this reason, schools shall be encouraged, and the means of education shall forever be encouraged in the Northwest Territory. And so education is a big part of the framework that they're going to build out in these new territories because they think that's what you need to make a good, virtuous Republican citizen. Finally, the most important rule that you need to take away from the Northwest Ordinance drives into it has nothing to do with republicanism and has everything to do with that other major topic from our class, slavery. Slavery would not ever be allowed in these territories. From their existence as territories and then all the way up to when they're basically brought in and made states as part of the Union, these territories do not have slaves. They never have. Now, there's a few practical reasons for it. Number one, what are you going to do with a slave in a place that's frozen 7 months out of the year? So it's not a whole great opportunity for agriculture in the upper Midwest. There are opportunities, and there might have been a few slaves moved into these areas by the way of the French or when the British were in control. But this has everything to do with Jefferson's vision for America. Remember, he's the one who kind of game planned this whole new territory. Jefferson sees America in this way. And remember, we're talking about the largest slave owner in Virginia in his lifetime. But he thinks about slavery in a way that you might not expect. It's a little bit more nuanced. He's not just some blind, drooling at the mouth, fervent racist. What he says is America, and I think I bring this quote up either in this lecture or in another one. What Thomas Jefferson says about slavery is this: it's like holding a wolf by the ears. What are you going to do? We already got it, right? I'm already holding him by the ears. If I drop this wolf, what's he going to do? He's going to rip my throat out because he's a wolf. That's what he's going to do. But am I going to walk around for the rest of my life holding the wolf by the ears? It's not very convenient. And so what he says is, look, we're screwed. We already have slavery here. It's already here. It's already a blight on our society. Believe it or not, even though he's one of the largest slave owners, Jefferson does not believe that slavery should exist in the future of America. He doesn't see America as a place for slavery. That's not what he wants. Jefferson has this vision of America becoming a land for white family farmers who take care of themselves. That is his whole goal for the United States of America. And that's why he doesn't allow slavery in these new territories. A white family farmer cannot compete with a plantation owner who's got 150 slaves. And Jefferson knows this. So he makes sure slavery never makes it into this territory so that white farmers will have a chance to compete. When we get to the end, the Northwest Ordinance leads to the creation of 6 new states in the United States. Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and most of what today we call Minnesota will all ratify their state constitutions and join the Union under the rules laid out in the Northwest Ordinance, although it's going to happen at drastically different times. The quickest state to meet all of the objectives and rules laid out in that ordinance is Ohio. They get statehood in 1803. But Minnesota doesn't get statehood until 1858. We're talking almost, not quite, but almost 100 years after the Northwest Ordinance was passed in 1787. You're coming about 20 years short. So this shows you how long it's taking for these upper Midwest or Great Lakes territories to get enough people there to become states. It takes them quite a long time. So when you look back over the ordinances, I kind of gave you a review slide there, and that'll tell you what each one of them is about. The most important is definitely the Northwest Ordinance. That is the final governing law for how those territories become states. So we're going to shift regions, shift gears a little bit, and move over to an event that highlights some of the weaknesses with the Articles of Confederation, and that event is Shays' Rebellion between 1786 and 1787. Here we got to look at what's going on in terms of former soldiers. The farmers are hit pretty hard. As I've already mentioned, farmers are having a hard time. They owe a lot of debt. And a lot of the farmers are actually veterans of the American Revolution. They picked up weapons and fought for this country's independence. And they are being hit particularly bad by these post-war economic problems. In Massachusetts, it's worse than any other place. So there's a leader of a rebellion that starts out. It starts out in a place called Northampton, Massachusetts. This guy, Daniel Shays, what he does is he starts organizing the veterans together to deal with the problem of tax collections and foreclosures on a large number of farms that were being seized by creditors. So basically what he does is he gets a bunch of armed men, like I said, many of whom had fought in the Revolution, and they all march on the town of Northampton, Massachusetts, and they go to the courthouse, and they block the judges from entering this courthouse. The reason being is, it's one thing to owe somebody a debt. They can't come, like for example, if you owe somebody money for your car, they can't come to your driveway in the middle of the night, smash the window, jump in, hotwire it, and drive away. They have to get a legal order to repossess that car. It's no different back then. So the judges have to sign off on the creditors seizing these farmlands. So Shay's logic is, if we block them from entering the courthouse, they can't foreclose on these lands, and that's how they're going to begin this rebellion. When word of this catches the Massachusetts state governor, he sends out a segment of the Massachusetts militia to meet the Shayite at a place called Great Barrington, Massachusetts. Now, this is a particularly embarrassing episode for the state of Massachusetts and their governor. 800 of the 1,000 militiamen that were sent out to stop the rebellion actually joined up with it. And so the rebellion just got stronger by about 800 men. And so, again, you can see why this would happen. The guys who are forming the Massachusetts militia, also veterans of the American Revolution, also farmers who probably are facing some rough economic conditions. And so, ultimately, you get this really ridiculous episode where 1,000 guys go to stop a rebellion and 800 of them join it. So the Shayshites are now emboldened. They're stronger. And they're going to go try to take an arsenal at Springfield, Massachusetts. But somebody lets the cat out of the bag, and a larger contingent of the Massachusetts militia is going to meet them there and defeat them militarily in this particular fight. So this rebellion is going to force Congress and American politicians to reconsider the Articles of Confederation. The reason these veterans weren't able to pay off the debts on their farm is because they weren't getting paid for their pensions and their roles in the American Revolution, because the American government couldn't raise the money to pay them. And so there is a direct cause and effect relationship between Shay's rebellion and the push for constitutional reform. Constitutional reform is something that's talked about at length in your textbook. I'm just going to highlight a few key pieces of it. I don't necessarily want to beat a dead horse, but this is a very important part of American history. And there's two, I want to try to make this as simple as possible for everybody involved. Because you could get very, very deep. You could have an entire class on the Constitutional Convention. And we're in a survey level class. I don't want to get that deep to what Benjamin Franklin said to James Madison on day 3 at minute 7 of the meeting. None of that's important. But there's two key issues that are going to come out at the Constitutional Convention. One is representation in the legislature. How do states get representation? And then 2, slavery. Those are the two key issues that are going to be rearing their ugly heads and making this whole endeavor incredibly difficult for the Founding Fathers to put this nation together. So the reason that they put the Constitutional Convention together is because the Articles of Confederation suck and they're not getting the job done, to put it as crassly and as bluntly as I can. In 1877, delegates from 12 of the states decide that they're going to meet in secret in Philadelphia to discuss this idea of constitutional reform. The reason that they are doing this in secret is because a large segment of the Founding Fathers didn't think they were going to be able to get this done. They basically were looking at this and going, if I make a bunch of promises to people in America that we're going to go and get the Constitution rewritten and make it perfect, then ultimately if we fail to do this, people are going to want my head on a stick. I don't want to go make a bunch of promises. And the reality is most of the Founding Fathers didn't think they were going to be able to come to a consensus on constitutional reform. James Madison gets there a little bit early, and his delegation from Virginia gets there early. There's bad weather traveling for a lot of people traveling to Philadelphia, but he has a pretty easy ride from Virginia. And basically, he is going to propose what's known as the Virginia Plan. In this plan, the state governments retain some authority, but ultimately they would be subject to any decisions or laws passed by the federal government. So it makes a very clear statement about the federal government has more authority than the state government, puts them above. Now, this plan proposed an executive branch, a 2-house legislature with an upper and lower house, and a separate judiciary. Now, in both of those legislatures, state representation would be proportional to their population. In other words, if you are in a state with 5 people, you don't get much authority on a national level at all. But if you're in a state with 5 million, then you get a lot of authority. And so basically, this is the big argument. How do we divvy up the votes between small states and large states within these legislatures? Virginia being one of the most populous states, it's clear that Madison's going to go, yeah, I'm from Virginia. We should just make it based on population because Virginia is one of the most populous places in America. Now, obviously this plan doesn't sit real well with everybody. The small states are going to vehemently oppose this plan. And so the William Patterson is a delegate from New Jersey, and he comes up with his own plan. And he says, nah, that's not how we should do it. We should follow my plan. And he's from New Jersey, so it's called the New Jersey plan. This plan calls for slight modifications to the Articles of Confederation. So the Articles of Confederation already have some rules in place, right? Part of those rules are there's one national legislature, and every state gets one vote there. Everyone's equal. Doesn't matter whether you're New Jersey and you don't have any people or you're New York and you have millions of people, which is how it looked back then. New Jersey is quite populous today. Don't go quoting me on that. But everybody gets one vote. Every state, one vote. That's it. That's how the legislature would work. The legislature could tax citizens and regulate interstate commerce to raise money. So as far as Patterson's concerned, there was one major problem with the Articles of Confederation. They couldn't raise any tax dollars or any revenues for the government. This is now fixed with the New Jersey plan. The plan gets rejected, obviously, because we didn't work on this particular structure. But what this shows you is that there is an immediate divide as to how the small states and the large states see representation in Congress. The large states are going, it should be based on the number of people you got there, right? You know, you're technically a representative. You represent people. And if there's more people, then your vote should be higher than the guy who represents nobody. And so, whereas the small states are saying, no, everybody should just get one vote and everything's equal. So obviously, there's a lot of different plans. They have different views as to how this is all going to work. Now, this is going to lead to one of the first. There's a couple of things they call the Great Compromise in American history. This is the legislative compromise, or the legislative part of the Great Compromise. Delegates from Connecticut named Oliver Ellsworth and Roger Sherman, they are going to create a plan in which there is a dual legislature that meets the needs of small states and large states. So they basically copy Madison's Virginia plan. And then they go, here's where you went wrong, Madison. There should be two houses in the legislature. There'd be an upper house, and that would have equal representation, regardless of what state you come from. Every state should get equal votes in this upper house. Spoiler alert, we call that Senate. The lower house would then contain representation that was proportional to a state's population. We call that the House of Representatives now. And so what they're doing here is they're saying, look, there's two houses. Why not use one to meet the needs of small states, use the other one to meet the needs of large states? Both sides adopt this sort of compromise. They go, that works for me. Let's go ahead and move forward on that. But it raises another equally contentious issue, and another great compromise is going to have to happen here. And great not being qualitative as much as quantitative. A large compromise is going to be made. And that is over the issue of slavery. Now that the states have all agreed to representation, a new question comes up. And it's not necessarily related to slavery directly. We're talking about state representation, and then somebody astutely goes, what about all those places that have a bunch of slaves, like 100 slaves on a plantation in a small local area? Do slaves count as part of the population? Or they're people, but they're treated like property? Can they be taxed as property? And all of a sudden, this question gets opened up about when it started about legislation and representation in the legislature, and it immediately shifts to slavery because the question becomes, what do slaves mean for counting your population? Obviously, if you look at the American South, you have places like South Carolina. White people are already outnumbered by slaves in a lot of areas of South Carolina. They are already a minority in their own home. And so states that have a high number of slaves, like South Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, these places, they look at this and they go, if we don't count slaves as part of the population, there's more people in New York than there is in almost the entire South. If you take Virginia out of the South, then there's more people in any one colony or any one state in the North than there is in all of the states of the South combined. And so they would never have these, they don't have big populations down there unless you count the slaves. And so they demand that states that oppose slavery are looking at this and going, wait a minute, you want to count slaves as part of your population. Do you let them vote? No. Do you let them own land? No. Do you treat them like people? No, they're property, basically. Well, then why the hell are you going to count them as part of the population? You don't treat them like people. They don't get to vote, so you can't count them as part of your population like they're citizens. And this, they look at this and they go, and that's what the southern states wanted, and what they demanded actually was slaves should always be counted 100% of the time as part of the population in our census count, and they shouldn't be taxed as property. It's not fair. This is ridiculous. They're basically asking for their cake and they're going to eat it too. And so the slave states are saying they should be counted as full and legal citizens when you're counting population, but they shouldn't be taxed as if they were a form of property. And so this is very hard for Northerners who are already kind of against slavery to wrap their head around. They're going, what are you talking about? You say they're property. That's how you're able to legally hold them in slavery, right? Yeah. And well, then why can't we tax them? Property is taxed. Well, I don't want to pay. They're humans. You can't tax them. What is a human being worth? Well, you don't treat them like humans, so I still am not understanding why I can't put tax on a slave. And so the compromise that comes out here is this. This is known as the 3/5 compromise. The compromise over the legislative issue is known as the Connecticut compromise. This is called the 3/5 compromise. And this is what it says. They say that slaves will be counted in the census count in the population and as taxes under a 3/5 proportion. In other words, they are counted as 3/5 of a person when you're taking the state census for voting authority. But they are also going to count as 3/5 of an economic resource. You can't tax them at a full rate and you can't count them as a full person. But they can be taxed and they can be counted towards the state census count and the population count. And this is a compromise that really is going to, it really is not well received by the Northern delegates. But we'll see why they accept this. As soon as the argument shifts, it gets brought up about slavery. When people start talking about slavery, the Southern delegates are pretty tricky here. They start jumping forward and going, basically, yeah, you're right. Slavery, it's awful. The Atlantic slave trade is the worst. We need to put a stop to the Atlantic slave trade. And when you start reading the personal writings of guys at this convention, like Madison in his letters, he says, look, the biggest divide at this convention was slavery from start to finish. This is the biggest hot button issue we had to deal with. George Mason, who is a major slaveholder in Virginia, he gets up on his chair in the middle of this meeting and, the Atlantic slave trade is the cruelest thing that's ever happened in human history. We need to get rid of it. This is awful. And he is immediately shouted down by Northerners who see through his hypocrisy and his BS. They go, listen here, Mason, you're one of the largest slave owners in all of the United States at this point. If we go ahead and outlaw the Atlantic slave trade, you just became King Daddy slave trader here in the United States. He stands to make a bunch of money because now slave trade will only be domestic and internal, and he's going to be the biggest supplier. So people are just going, you selfish, you know what? We know what you're trying to say here, and that's why you're attacking the Atlantic slave trade. We're not talking about the Atlantic slave trade. We're talking about domestic slavery. Let's stay on topic here. Because America's involvement in the Atlantic slave trade was pretty marginal over time anyway. Most of the slaves in the U.S. came in by way of the Caribbean. So, South Carolina, as they always do, are going to be the staunchest, they are always the staunchest defenders of slavery. The delegation from South Carolina stands up right there in front of everybody and basically throws a hissy fit. And they go, this is it. This is it. You are going to say slavery is legal, or at the very least, you're not going to put any restrictions on slavery whatsoever. If you try to mess with slavery in any way, shape, or form in this Constitution, we're not signing it. And the other southern states aren't going to sign it. And now, if you don't have everybody unanimous support for this Constitution, you don't have a nation. And so basically, what they're going to start saying, and you can look at their arguments, they go back to this idea of the virtuous republic to justify slavery as well. They go, hey, what was the greatest society in the world? Oh, yeah, the Roman old antiquity, the Roman Republic. Guess what the Roman Republic had? Slaves. And so they say, you can't have a virtuous republic and have a successful state without slavery. And so if you're really claiming to believe in this idea of the virtuous republic and this model of ancient Rome and their republic that we're trying to build upon, then you have to allow for slavery. Ultimately, the way this all pans out is this is just people at each other's throats the entire convention over this issue of slavery. A number of founding fathers in America do not want slavery to be legal. They want it outlawed in the Constitution before any other nation on earth has outlawed slavery. But the South is going to hold them hostage. They say, look, you need us. You don't have a nation without us. So here's your options. Allow for slavery, or we're out of here. That's it. We're walking away. So the framers of the Constitution who are anti-slavery, who are abolitionists, they basically were bullied into having to, they basically said, if we don't get this thing done and we don't get it signed and everybody doesn't agree, we've got nothing. There's no nation. And the whole war was for nothing. And this whole experiment is going to fail. So they said, okay, we're going to basically tacitly, we're not going to say anything about the legality or the illegality of slavery in the Constitution. It's just not going to be a non-issue. We're not going to address it. And if you read the writings of even some slaveholders felt this way. Jefferson's one of them. He ain't going to give up his own slaves. But the founding fathers, their belief was that slavery was not a permanent fixture of American society. They don't see it going far into the future. And it makes sense because at this point in time, it's not that profitable and it's not that widespread in America. It's there. It's prevalent. You'll see it if you're walking through the streets every day. But the reality is you don't have people making bajillions of dollars off the backs of their slaves in the late 1700s. It's not until the cotton boom and the invention of the cotton gin that slavery is reinvigorated. For the most part, slavery as a practice was kind of dying out naturally. And the founding fathers were saying, well, why sit here and fight about it with these Southerners if it's going to die out on its own? So just drop the whole thing and we'll let it go. And that's what they generally are going to do. And that's how they come to this compromise, and everybody walks away feeling as if they've accomplished something. So the word slavery itself does not appear in the U.S. Constitution, but there are two articles written into the Constitution that provide a tacit protection for slavery. The first one is Article 4, Section 2. This regulates the handling of fugitive slaves. In other words, what it says is slaves are property under U.S. law, and a slave can be reclaimed if they're caught in some other area. So Article 1, Section 8 is a little bit more relevant here. This is reflective of a major fear that the South has at the time they're talking about this Constitution. They are concerned, the financial thinkers, the real money minds of the United States are all up north. They are all in New York, Massachusetts, Philadelphia. They're up in those areas. And their fear, the fear of Southern slave owners at this point is that the North wants slavery abolished. They're not going to do it by law. They're not going to come in and tell us we can't have our slaves anymore. It's not good and it's against the law. They're going to do it economically by taxing slave-produced goods so heavily that slavery is no longer profitable. They're going to drive it into the ground and kill it. That was their major concern. So they got Article 1, Section 8 written into the Constitution that says you cannot put overly high prices on slave-produced goods. So the Constitution there, we've come to these kinds of compromises, these conclusions that are going to help people sort of get on with their lives and move forward. But that doesn't mean that the Constitution has been accepted yet. They've only drafted it. So they had immediately as this Constitution is introduced to the American people, you get the America breaking into two polar opposite groups, as we're wont to do in most circumstances. You have Federalists. They are people who supported the ratification of the Constitution in its current form. Anti-Federalists are unprepared to ratify the Constitution in its current form. The basic fight here is this. Anti-Federalists, as their name suggests, feel that the Constitution gives the United States government, the central federal government, too much power. It vests too much authority in the hands of the central government, and because of that, the government will be able to use that power to abuse the people. And they look at the Constitution, and this is true. If you look at the Constitution, I always ask people, what are your constitutional rights? And they start listing things that come from the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is not part of the original Constitution. They are 10 amendments that are tagged on later. In the original Constitution, it doesn't say much of anything about our rights as citizens. We don't have rights as citizens according to that document. It's just talking about the structure of government, regulating commerce, dealing with what is the scope of federal powers versus state powers. And so when we see the Constitution being put out, there are a lot of people who go, that looks like it's going to turn into monarchical England where the government's going to get corrupt and use it to abuse us. It's not protecting us. It's not enshrining our Enlightenment era ideals. And so that you have these anti-federalists pretty much spearheaded by guys like Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. They are going to be the ones who are pushing back against this idea. They say, we don't want to sign that document. That's not a good constitution. It gives too much authority to the central government, and it leaves the people vulnerable and exposed to oppression by the government. So Federalists are going to make some early gains in ratifying the Constitution without any amendments. In Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, and Georgia, they get people to just immediately go, yeah, Constitution as it is, it's good. But there are others in less decisive states, and they're going to take a road of compromise. Essentially, what is happening here is that you have a document that doesn't protect any individual liberties. And what happens is that Madison starts already, he's already drafted up the Bill of Rights, and he's kicking it around. And what is going on is people now are debating one of two options. Do we sign the Constitution in its current form to get our government up, running, and off the ground? Or do we reject this Constitution and make them go back to the drawing board, and then we accept a Constitution that will have more private liberties? Madison says, look, we can do both. Accept the Constitution in its current form, and we will add these amendments to it later, known as the Bill of Rights, and that will protect individual citizens' liberties. And so, in 1788, by that time, the Federalists had already gotten the 9 states they needed to accept the Constitution. That was enough to get it put into law. But there's a reality here. If you don't get everybody on board, then they can go back later and say, well, I never agreed to that. We didn't sign the Constitution. They can act like they don't belong to your country and aren't subject to the same rules. And so the reality is you need unanimous support for the Constitution from all of the states. And New York is really the one that faces this critical challenge. Rhode Island and North Carolina are still sitting on the fence, but the attitude at the time is they're just going to wait and see what New York does and then follow suit. And they ultimately do. But New York is going to look at this and they say, look, we can either oppose the Constitution or ratify it and know that we can change it later with amendments. Work on changing the system from within. And they ultimately take that latter road. And the anti-federalist contingent in this round is effectively defeated. And so our Constitution would be ratified and adopted into law. But that's not where this ends. That's where our lecture ends for this week. But when we pick it back up next week, we're going to start talking about the addition of a Bill of Rights and this fight between Federalists and Anti-Federalists who are going to start forming a wholly different political party. And they're going to give rise to our earliest kind of partisan political infighting. And that's a trend that I promise you will exist throughout the entire duration of the history of the United States of America. So that wraps up my lecture for this week, talking about the early republic, looking at virtue and the virtuous republic, and constitutional reform. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. I'm always available to talk over, not Skype, what's the new thing? Zoom, if you need to. So always feel free to drop me a line. Take care.